So, the folks at Blender Foundation have just announced the beta version of Blender 4.0. This is the most recent testable version of Blender for those who are thinking about migrating to the new version once this is out. With lots of features coming over to Blender 4.0, it is worth mentioning that if you're thinking about migrating to this one, this is the right time to test for bugs and also give bug reports to developers to make Blender better. And for those who like to get this, all you need to do is go over to blender.org, go over to download, scroll all the way down to where you have download Blender Experimental, and right here you'll be able to download Blender 4.0, the beta. You would also see that Blender 4.1 is coming and this is now in alpha. Currently there is no new feature that is available for this one, but hopefully features will be rolling in very soon and we'll be talking about those as well. So for the 4.0, here's a few things that you need to know that is coming over to Blender 4.0. Meanwhile, if you take a look at the Blender 4.0 release note, you would notice that there are certain significant things. So the very first thing which you would notice right here, it's no longer cycles and rendering, rather rendering now has a specific tab and cycles has its own specific tab. Scrolling all the way down, there is a compatibility thing that is coming with this one, which means that the mesh format changes from previous versions are now included with the Blender 5 format. So Blender 3.6 LTS can read files from Blender 4.0, but earlier versions cannot. The same thing can be said with Blender 3.6 being able to save meshes in format compatible with older versions of Blender, so you can use that to convert your files for backward compatibility issues if you're coming from Blender 4.0 and you like to open these files in Blender 3.5. Additionally, there is a new Blender file compatibility policy which has now been implemented for those who like to take a look at this, and the OBJ and PLY input-output add-ons have now been removed since their formats are now natively imported and exported by default in Blender. Moving on, some of the things that you would notice, there is one thing which you would probably notice. Unlike other versions of Blender, this doesn't have a new splash screen, but then there's a lot of things that you'll be noticing right in here which is totally different from what you've seen in every other Blender. And for comparison, let's take a look at Blender 3.6 and 4.0 and talk about some of the UI improvements. Once you open up Blender 4.0 and Blender 3.6 is this. The UI looks pretty different. Now, if you go over to the UI, the first thing which you would notice is the font is now different. Now, the font that is being used is called Inner, and I kind of think that the Inner Extra Light or the Inner Light is the one that is being used. Compared to what we had before, this looks a little bit interesting, pretty similar to the Deja Vu font, which you can of course go ahead and download. And for those who are looking for the Blender Pro font, which I've used in several videos, you can also find that here. I'm going to put these links in the description just in case you'd like to see it. One other thing which you'd notice is Eevee is no longer written with title case. Eevee is now written in all caps, and in terms of files, there is a save incremental which is now available, and you can choose to register what version of Blender you would like to use or unregister it. This is currently available for 4.0. If you're working with the file browser, you can now preview files with transparent backgrounds. The file browser also shows previews of SVG files just in case you like to preview them as well. Another interesting thing you'll notice when working with Blender 4.0 is the color picker has now been increased in size, which makes it even more visible for lots of people to work with. The outliner drag and drop now works between multiple windows, and the outliner select hierarchy now works with multiple selected objects. And in terms of language, the Catalan language has now been added to Blender, so just in case you speak that, it is also worth mentioning that you can now have complete coverage of that particular language when working in Blender. So speaking about the UI, if you take a look at the default selection mode, you would notice that for 4.0 we have a brand new masking section that deals with stencil and cavity mask. So you can actually turn these things on and off if you want, but if you take a look at 3.6, you would notice that we don't have that. Meanwhile, there's a few things which I think a lot of you guys may or may not love. With 3.6, if you take a look up here, you'd notice nothing, but in 4.0, the beta, the alpha, any of them, you now see when your files are unsaved. I love this feature. It looks very familiar with what you have in Cinema 4D, and I love it. The next UI update is something I don't know how you guys will feel about it, but let's take a look. So by default, if you're working in Blender, you can simply go over to your modifier section and click, go down, subdivision, click, go down, wireframe, increase that wireframe. Beautiful, straightforward, easy, one click you find it. Now with 4.0 beta alpha 81, if you go over to your modifier, there's a button. So with the button you click, you go to generate, then you find subdivision surface, and you can also do the same thing, click, go over, and then find wireframe. Now for me, I don't know how you guys would take it, and I wouldn't want to influence your decisions. All I'm saying is I do love the idea of one single click, find what you're looking for, rather than one click and you go through this means. Although, to be fair, if you take a look at the modifier, you would notice we have more stuff. For example, we have the hair now, we have the edit. So the edit now replaced what we had before as modifier. So the beautiful new thing now is the renaming and also the hair. There's also this section called unassigned, which deals with geometry nodes, and you can also see the same geometry nodes up here. There is an organization going on. I love the fact that that is happening, but I'm caught in between how to feel about this particular button. So I would like to know what you guys think about that one in the comments. If you're voting for or against it, let me know. At the same time, it is something that might grow on everyone later, but this first implementation, I'm not so sure how it looks, how it feels. This just simply looks very easy. Click, find what you're going for. These are the one click, I don't know. Maybe we can have some updates to this over time. But either ways, let's talk about the new updates that I think you guys would actually love. So for this one, let's go over to geometry nodes and roll over to geometry nodes. So by default, if you select your object and click on new, you get that geometry node going for you. And you would also notice that we can get that here. First things you notice is the group looks different. So there's an update to the group section, which is super nice. I love this one. Meanwhile, every single time you're working in geometry nodes, you hit Shift and tap A on your keyboard, you can go to search and type stuff. Yes, so I can say simulation and get that simulation zone popping out. We can do the same thing and go right here and type in the word transform and get that transform right here. Looking cool, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. We love it. But now in 4.0, you don't have that. You cannot search for stuff, except for the fact that you can now even search way better. So if you hit Shift and tap on the keyboard, instead of going over to the section where you need to click on search, just start typing. So we can type in simulation zone and we can get a simulation zone out there, and we can go ahead and just hit Shift and tap A and type in the word transform. So in several places where you have the same type of thing, you would notice that you have them all in different subcategories. So in this case, you can see it says geometry, operations, transform. And if you're looking for something, for example, like blend or clamp, you can see where they exist and what uses what. So this way you have more flexibility and ways to work within your geometry node. And this is across the entire UI. So instead of having one custom here and you go over here, one custom there, you can just simply come through and just start typing and search for stuff instead of doing this, and that doesn't work. All right, so that is one of the main reasons why you would notice a lot of key map and updates and changes happening throughout the entire 4.0 series of Blender. These and a couple of other improvements are now available, which also includes snapping, some beautiful things with modifiers, and like we mentioned before in the previous video, the node preview has now been moved to an overlay display above the node. And this reminds me of an add-on, which I'm also going to link in the description, just in case you'd like to see that. These and more are coming to Blender 4.0's UI. But that is not all. Keymaps is having an update. So if you're working with Blender and there are certain keymaps that you get to work with, I would suggest that you come through and double check the keymaps. There are several updates that are making their way to 4.0 as this deals with sculpting, painting, and also the grease pencil. This would allow for better support of current and future features, which only will be affecting the sculpting, painting, and grease pencil related models. In terms of left click select, right click select, and 3 mouse button emulation, there are also updates for that. There's also a few shortcuts that have been removed, and for common shortcuts, various shortcuts are now consistent and shortcut conflicts are fixed, allowing for more features to be supported across different modes where common shortcuts are being used. And for industry compatible keymaps, there is a couple of things that you might need to know. Some of these would remain for future support of keymaps in the future, and if any of the shortcut isn't mentioned within this section, which we're talking about, that means it is unchanged. So you can find some of these in terms of mode switching, brush versus selection, brush size versus select length, select and mask, face set and visibility, transforming, sculpting, painting, grease pencil, and of course, a set of others. So if you're into shortcuts, you might want to confirm if the shortcuts that you're working with have been changed, altered, or if they still remain the same, especially if you like to use 4.0. And for modeling, we're having about 4 major changes, and this deals with transform. Furthermore, there is also one shape key, and of course, there's conversations about the UV editing, which is also coming over to Blender. But unlike various versions of Blender, which deals with 0.0, for example 3.0, 2.90 and also the 2.80. This version of Blender seems to be coming with more of a quality of life set of improvement compared to features, as it seems like they've gotten to that point where most of the features that are required for modeling are now there, and they are more focused on performance and quality of life improvement. Like currently, there's a new snapping symbol which you can see, and of course there's a few more things with bones now supported for snapping in terms of aligning rotation to target, and for shape keys, the blend from shape to propagate to shape operators now respect X symmetries. And to make up for modeling, some things have been added to geometry node. So the repeat zone node is now finally here. Finding this in beta solidifies the fact that the repeat zone node is here to stay, and this node allows for repetition of certain nodes which exist within the zone. So if you do create an input node for both the repeat and an output node, whatever node you put in between gets repeated over and over depending on the iteration that has been plugged in. And this is super interesting to see, owing to the fact that it is similar to what you have with the simulation node, only that simulation node deals with playback, while this one deals with iteration, which can be controlled with other node. Moving on, there's also a set of updates to certain nodes, as the mesh sharp edge status is accessible in bulletin nodes. The mesh to volume node now generates a proper fog volume rather than the converted sine distance view, and the point to curve node group now positions cloud points into curves and sort each curve's point based on a given weight. Additionally, the add modifier menu has now been changed to a standard menu, and it extends with custom modifiers from geometry node group asset. There's also some performances in terms of the curve to mesh, and for those who are thinking about working with the node editor, the node panel, there are certain things for you to walk through, and you can find them right here. And for animation, the breaking/backward incompatibility changes, like we mentioned before, is also affecting some things that you'll be working with in terms of animation and rigging. 1 to 9 hotkeys for switching collection visibility has been removed from the pose library, and certain graph editor slider tools had their range changed from 0 to 1 to -1/1, which includes blender to neighborhood, breakdown, and ease. The push rest pose and relax rest pose operators has been merged into blend pose with rest pose, and of course there are a few changes that have been made in terms of the graph editor, the NLA, and dope sheet, as also snapping for the graph editor, NLA, and dope sheet has been moved to the scene, and amateur layers to bone groups has also been removed, and this has now been replaced with bone collections and pair bone colors. So let's take a look at how this one actually works. So by default, when you're working with Blender and you're using a bone, what you have is one color, and let's say you go over to your edit mode and you're trying to edit this, you can make as much of this as you want. One thing which you notice is if you go over to your pose, it remains the same. If you go back to your edit or even your object, it remains the same. But what if in your edit mode, you like to have a given color to identify maybe troublesome bones or joints, or probably you're looking for joints that you would want to work on later. So with 4.0, you can now do that. All you need to do is go over to the bone section, viewport. You can either hide or unhide the joint and give it colors. So you can give any color of choice. And where this actually makes even way more sense is these colors can also be alternated over time. So if you go over to your pose mode and for some reason you would like to have your joints having a particular color when posing, this can be done because within the pose mode, right now, you can give pose bone colors. And whenever we are posing, we're definitely getting this color. If we go back to edit, this is the color we have. We switch back to pose. This is the color we have. The layers have now been replaced with collections. So instead of jumping to layers, what you can now do in your edit mode is to select any of these joints, press M on the keyboard, and enter a new collection name. So I'm just going to call this bone 1. We can of course go ahead and add the other bones into another collection. And in some cases, if these don't apply or they don't get into these collections, you can definitely make changes and update them to be where you want them to be. And I can tell you for free that most of the features that we've just looked at are quality of life features compared to just everyday features that exist in Blender. Moving on, still talking about animation, certain operators have been renamed. Instead of bake curve, we now have key to samples, and also instead of sample keyframes, we now have bake keyframes. And for Python and RNA API, the fcurve update now also deduplicates the fcurves key. With that as well, there's also a new mapping vertices method for bendy bone segments, and this includes straight mapping and curved mapping. There is a set of deformations for those who would like to see these, and for pose library, this now uses the newly introduced asset shelf to make pose assets available in 3D views. Also, there are updates to the NLA, rigging, the graph editor, and of course we now have a new set of operators. And for performance, there is a significant performance when working within the graph editor, as you can see with the setup that contains 6,000 keys per channels on 62 bones, and you can tell that the performance in 4.0 is way better than what we have with 3.6. And for sculpting, painting, and texture, there's little to no updates. Currently, we have only 3 updates. The expand mask now has an inverted fill, and there's also the removal of the dynamic topology smooth shading option. At the same time, if you're doing your painting, you can now add set vertex colors options to lock alphas. And like we mentioned, there is a new section that deals with rendering and also a different section that deals with cycles. So for rendering, there's a few updates to the principal BSDF. Taking a look at this, you can tell that the principal BSDF has been reworked in a sense. And I guess that's the main reason why rendering has a category of its own. So if you take a look here, you would notice sheen and coat are above emission. And what sheen does now is totally different, and what coat does now is also totally different. Moving on, you'd also notice something in terms of subsurface. The subsurface now uses the default base color. So unlike what we had with 3.6, where you have a subsurface color, the subsurface now reads its color directly from the base color. Every other thing that has to do with subsurface you can find under the subsurface. You can tell that the new principal BSDF looks cleaner, nicer, and I believe will be more efficient in the way we get to work with it. Like we mentioned earlier, if you take a look here, you would see that clear coat stays down here, and now clear coat stays right on top. The sheen looks better. There is a whole new idea for working with sheen. Traditionally, sheen used to be used for fuzzy clothes, but now this is now being used for dust and arbitrary materials. And I love the compact feel. So you want to deal with coat, you go down there. You want to deal with transmission, you go down here. You want to deal with specularity. It's clean, it's simple. I like this. There's also a good set of updates for the BSDF nodes and also the texture nodes. And in terms of texture nodes, you do have updates to the noise and also the Voronoi texture. And for those who are thinking about exploring things with the light UVs are now available for all light sources in the image texture node. Alongside this, it is worth keeping in mind that light sources have slightly different behaviors than before for energy preservation and better compatibility with other renders. And this includes the point light, the sunlight, and also the corrected conversion factor for the area light. And for color management, AGX, which is a view transform, is now here. So AGX has been added to Blender 4.0 and it is a big win. And of course, in comparison with Filmic on different images or in any render image, the new view transform provides better color handling and an overall exposed area compared to Filmic in almost all ramifications. And when you're working with HDR display on macOS, you will definitely notice a much better improvement. There's a new set of color spaces, and for sure, if you're into legacy features, this has now been removed. So I do think that the whole idea of having rendering to stand alone makes a lot of sense, where we can discuss basic things that exist for both Eevee and cycles in one space, while cycles would have its own section. And speaking about cycles, light and shadow linking, which we've talked over and over on the channel before, is coming. So this is really cool to see that finally it's making its way to 4.0, and there's also some good updates to performances, future improvements, and for those who are into path guiding, this is also available. The multi-scattering GGX, which we mentioned for rendering, has been replaced by an approximation based on a practical multiple scattering compensation for microfacet models by Emmanuel. So this simply removes the performance and noise disadvantage that used to be associated with multi-scattering GGX, making it a safe default pick when working with the principal BSDF. There's a good set of updates coming to the principal hair BSDF, as a new variant, which is called Huang, is now added based off a microfacet based hair scattering model paper. And for those who are thinking about reading more about this, you can definitely come through and see these ones for yourself. So Cycles is having a facelift, and you can see some more improvements with the open shader language. But that's not all for rendering. There's a few updates coming to Eevee, which you can see here. And again, just like we saw with modeling, in terms of updates coming to Eevee with a 0.0 release, Eevee is not really having so much. But what is having even more stuff than Eevee is the viewport compositor, as we now have the movie distortion, sunbeam, keying, the classic Kuhawara, in painting, anisotropic Kuhawara, and double edge masking. So let's take this first spin and see what we can get. So just like the other nodes that we mentioned that automatically shows you the thumbnails, in 4.0 you can now throw in those viewport effects. Actually, for you to get the viewport effect going, you need to go over to the drop down within the shading and turn on either camera, always, or disable. By default, this is set to disable, but if you just want the effect to be on camera, turn on camera. So for us to take a look at the Kuwahara, what we can do is tap Shift and tap A on the keyboard and type in the word Kuwahara, and there you have it. So we can throw this right in the middle, and automatically you start noticing we have that. If we choose to mute this, you see what we have. If we turn this back on, you see that. You can increase the size. Now the beautiful thing is this is happening real time on your viewport. So if you're trying to get that pixel art, there you go. So you can have it real time on your viewport. If you like to do a bit of lens distortion, of course you can. So we did mention that lens distortion is here. So you can select from any of the ones that exist here. So we can select lens distortion, and you've also got the lens dispersion. So you can throw that in there, and we can feed this over to the image, and we can distort this however we want, because we're distorting the lens. We can choose to use the projector and do some dispersion, and that looks good. If you don't like the classic one, you'd want the anisotropic, throw in the anisotropic, and you have it. The fact that you have these things and you can play back in real time and get these things working just exactly how you want that painterly feeling, especially if you're getting to do some, painterly animation. This looks super interesting, and a huge shout out to the developers for making this possible. And all of this can be seen within the VFX section. So once you're doing your compositing, or probably you're doing your viewport rendering and viewport compositing, you're definitely going to have fun working with this. And for sequencer, there are some retiming systems that is here, and sequencer seems not to be having too much love, especially when lots and lots of people will choose DaVinci Resolve over doing their editing in Blender Video Sequence Editor. Now for pipeline asset and input output, for USD, importing and exporting of light energy for both point light and spotlight now follows USD conversion more closely. There's also support invoking user-defined Python hook functions to extend the USD export functionalities, and there's a support for input-output for more types of generic mesh attributes. And in terms of animation import, there is now the support for USD scale, which is a file type that supports both skeleton and blend shape. And for Collada, which is the .dae file that lots of people use in place of FBX, amateurs exported to Collada now includes the amateur bones collection, including their visibility, and you can find out more when you go over to this page. In terms of 3ds, which we've already talked about before, 3ds is coming with lots of things. So you can now export hierarchy, you can export scale, you can export animation, you can convert measures properly now. There's update to object filters, volume, fog, gradient, and background beep. And if you have a Gobo image that you're using, it will now be exported as a light bitmap chunk and imported in the very same way when exporting or importing to .3ds. And the same thing can be said for in.3ds, as these file properties can now be saved when you're exporting to a .3ds file format. Cursor location, when working with Blender, once you export a file and choose to re-import that file into Blender, that cursor location can now be preserved. And for Hydrastorm, for those who are using the real-time renderer, which comes as part of USD, there is a few updates that you can work with. And for sure, like we mentioned before, OBJ and PLY add-ons have now been removed. Rigify do have a few add-ons updates that is now available, and for those who are into add-ons, or probably you do work with file exchanges, especially if you're flipping files back and forth, you can now find all of these interesting updates that are now available for both USD, FBX, Hydrastorm, .3ds, and the Collada 5 format. And for core, there are some breaking changes and a few library overrides. At the same time, there are potential breaking changes, which means that certain things might not be the same way they are for future versions of Blender. And there is also the blend file and compatibility, which we mentioned before, and a few minimum requirements just in case you're thinking of running this version on a new or an older PC. And at the same time, if you're working with Python, there are some breaking changes that deals with the asset system, the Windows Manager, the mesh, curves, nodes, shader nodes, light, particle system, the Blender application itself, the Blender operator, font module, GPU module, animation, amateur, node groups, sequencer, and also miscellaneous. So if you're into coding or you work with a Python API, you need to keep an eye for some of this, as 4.0 brings a gradual but yet massive change to how we get to work with Blender in several aspects of the app. So this is it. Blender 4.0, the beta is now here. And for those who are asking, or maybe you're wondering, what about Grease Pencil? So there is no update to Grease Pencil. and have no idea if there will be one coming or probably if it has been moved to 4.1, but hopefully we might see some updates with the final release. Of course, currently all of the features that we're seeing are more like locked-in features, and they would only continue with these features for 4.0 and find them on fixed bugs, which means that if there is any feature which you actually look forward to that wasn't mentioned or doesn't exist with this current documentation, that might probably not come to 4.0. Updates and features like EV Next might potentially come to 4.1, and hopefully once this shows up, we will also proceed to demo that. So this is it. For those who like to see more videos about Blender 4.0 and more detailed ones that we've covered in the past, links to that is going to be in the description, and you can also go over to the channel and feast your eyes on some amazing content that we have out there. And if you're new here, you can simply go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on the notification. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section, and of course if you like this video or you learned something from this, you can go ahead and give a like, and don't forget to share with a friend. And until I see you guys in the next one, peace.